In this bonus episode of the Educational Duct Tape Podcast, I'll be talking to two awesome educators about helping our students become technologically ambidextrous, developing rapport with students, being an edtech coach, educational paradigm shifts, standardized testing, supporting innovative teachers, and schools supporting innovative administrators. Let's get started.
I'm Lance Key, co-host of Get Inspired and Innovate, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Educational Duct Tape Podcast with Jake Miller.
Welcome. Hello, duct tapers. I am so glad to have you here with me today. This week, in between two awesome regular episodes, last week with the Casey Bell and next week with the Sam Carey, I'm sharing a bonus episode with you. I've got to be honest, when Erich and Ryan reached out to me about being on their podcast, The Peg Doesn't Fit, I had not heard of it before, but now I'm hooked. Their mindset in regards to improving our educational system and talking openly about it is just so great. And the conversation that I had with them was really dynamite. I really enjoyed it. I wish we could have kept talking, actually. And I enjoyed it so much that I want to share it with you. When I first listened to the episode, actually, I was also excited to hear Erich's intro, in which he shares an anecdote about assembling a new bike and how it relates to edtech integration. It kind of reminded me of his own version of a soapbox moment, and it was really enjoyable, and I really liked the metaphor, and I think you're going to love it too. So, without further ado, here's today's bonus episode coming from The Peg Doesn't Fit.
I bought a bike rack the other day that required some assembly. You know how that goes. You get a box that says some assembly required, but you open it up and it's got hundreds of little pieces and little screws and bolts, and it comes with directions. And you look at the directions and it's got all the pieces just kind of floating in the air with all the screws pointing at where to go. And when I looked at that, I just immediately got overwhelmed. I didn't even know where to start, even though the directions gives me a step-by-step way. So immediately, you know what? I said, this is too much for me. I am going to my dad's. So I go to my dad's for some help. And we start looking at it. We lay all the screws out. And he's just kind of as overwhelmed as me. But we started looking at the picture on the box. And we just took it one step at a time. And we started putting the pieces together and figuring out which screws go where. And once we got started, we kind of realized the pattern, and then we were able to assemble the rack one piece at a time. This kind of reminds me of today's episode, talking about technology with Jake Miller. You know, there are hundreds, even thousands of technology apps out there that teachers can use to help with their teaching. The problem is that when we look at all thousands of those apps at the same time, sometimes we get overwhelmed and we do what I did with the bike rack. We don't even start because we don't know where to begin. Jake talks about today building some ambidextrous skills with technology and just kind of focusing on that one app that really works for you. And what he means by ambidextrous is that you can kind of pivot from one to another. And that's kind of what I started to do with my dad as we started to understand how each of these screws kind of fit together. We started to realize the similarities. We started to realize which parts needed the bigger screws and which parts needed the smaller screws. And as you start to develop your skills with that one app you choose, you start to recognize, wait a second, these other apps, they kind of work in the same way. They're different, but they still have the same commonalities and the same language. And as you start to realize that, you start to get a little bit more comfortable with technology, and you start to feel that you're okay using other applications because you understand the guts of this one application. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I hope by the end of the episode you recognize that even though there are so many different options out there, it's not your job to know them all. Just know the one that feels most comfortable to you and the one that helps you become a better teacher than you are without it.
Welcome to The Peg Doesn't Fit. Peg Doesn't Fit is a podcast about the need for an educational paradigm shift. We have not quite decided if education is the whole or if it is the peg, but one thing is for sure, it doesn't fit.
Join us each week as we explore our metaphor and discuss the need for a systematic shift in the American educational system.
My name is Erich Stephen.
And I am Ryan Bartel. Welcome to The Peg Doesn't Fit.
Today's podcast features a dynamic interview with Jake Miller, the host of the Edu Duct Tape podcast. Ryan, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about Jake to get them ready for our interview?
Jake is an edtech learning enthusiast who hosts the Educational Duct Tape podcast and has created more than 100 #EDU GIFs. He works as a science teacher for a public middle school in Ohio and previously spent 5 years as a technology integration specialist and an additional 12 years in the classroom teaching math, science, and STEM at various grade levels. He has a dog named Kermit the dog and 3 kids, the youngest of which calls him Daddy Longlegs Spider Guac.
Today we have Jake Miller. Trying to make you feel at home, Jake. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we are glad that you joined us. Listen, our podcast focuses on the need for an educational paradigm shift. And I just want to jump right into this. I mean, the world is so much different from the world we lived in when formal education began. Despite all of our evolving world changes, we keep operating in the same way. If you could change one thing about education, where would you start?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm an educational technology guy, so I feel like I'm supposed to talk about educational technology here, but I just can't because I am, it is, so the springtime and I am currently in a classroom teaching role and I teach 8th grade science. And here in the state of Ohio, 8th grade science is a tested subject. And despite the fact that we have gone through a global pandemic over the last 14 months or however long it's been, we have state standardized testing coming up in a few weeks. And I think that the way that the system works with it, not the fact that we're assessing things. I think it's appropriate to assess because otherwise, how do we know if we're being effective and setting goals for the future? But I think kind of the way it works and the level of stress that's put on it, I think is the biggest problem that I see. And I think the other part of it too, as a classroom teacher, the biggest problem I see, like the most pedagogically unsound thing that I see even myself doing in the classroom is teaching all of my students as if they should all learn things at the same pace, right? Like everybody should learn and process things at the same rate, even though we know that that's not the way human brains work, but we do it because of those tests, I think. So I think those two things kind of go hand in hand because of the way our system works and because of the way it's tested. We keep teaching kids like they're all the same. And you know what? The peg doesn't always fit, right? I mean,
right.
I wasn't planning to get to there, but that's totally what it is we're treating all the pegs as the same thing because of the way that these tests and everything work.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up because you are a tech guy and we'll get to some technology, but our show isn't necessarily about technology. Now, the world we live in is pretty tech rich, and it would only seem natural that we do utilize some technology within our instruction. But it's about bigger than that. It's about what you just kind of talked about is what we are doing right now making sense.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of good ideas out there. It's just a matter of, we had a previous guest on, Ross Parker, and he said, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll just blow up education. And they'll say, let's start something new. And we start, and all of a sudden, like it goes a little haywire and it doesn't work. So we just go back to what was comfortable. It's hard to kind of stay focused with the shift. But we did recently have a pretty big shift with this remote/blended learning. Mm-hmm. This was a negative experience for far more students than I hoped it would be negative for. I hoped that this would be the jump that education needed, but some kids aren't ready for that. But some thrived in the setting. What did we learn in this setting that we should continue as students eventually all transition back into the normal of what school is supposed to be?
Yeah, I like, by the way, the point about, blowing everything up and kind of starting again there. You mentioned back to the beginning of that comment too. And I have to say, like I was just teaching, I was thinking as you were saying that, I also teach a digital fabrication class at my school, kind of as an elective that students can take. And we were talking about the design process, the engineering design process today. And we were talking about how that iteration happens and you don't start over again. You continue, but you tweak things and go back around the circle. But anyhow, so this year has been kind of like there's been like a new input put into that design process thinking, and we've had to reevaluate and change things. And I think the thing that happened this year that really impressed me and really wowed me, and that I hope stays around, is the way our teachers and the school staff, but especially the educators in the classrooms, assimilated to using new technologies and rapidly ramped up what they were doing. I, for years have been trying to convince educators that they don't have to be nervous about all the technologies out there. They just need to identify what it is they're trying to improve or fix, or what goals they have, what needs they have in their classroom, and then find the technologies that help with that, and ignore the other ones until they do meet a goal that they have, right? And it's been an uphill battle to get most educators to hear that because they're overwhelmed. But this year, you look at what happened back in the spring, right? They were like, well, I need to find a way to communicate with my students, and I need to find a way to post work to my students, and I need a way to hear from all of my students. And all of a sudden they became masters of Google Meet and Google Classroom and Zoom and Flipgrid and Screencastify because they directly met the goals that they had. And it was like they adopted that mindset without even thinking about it. So what I hope stays around is that educators continue to do that. Educators continue to go, what is it that I need in my classroom for learning or for effective outcomes, whatever it might be, and what technology tools can help me with that? And that's the one thing that I think that we've all gained from this year that I hope stays around.
Yeah. And if we think back to education in general, I mean, granted, yes, technology overwhelms a lot of people because it's something they're not comfortable with. But if we got all the books out about teaching strategies, teaching strategies would overwhelm you too. It's like you don't just throw in a towel and say, oh my gosh, I can't teach because there's too many different strategies. I don't know. It's like what you said. You just kind of take what feels right, something that you can hang on to and work with it and get better at it. And I was kind of guilty to this. At the beginning of the year, I was shooting out all kinds of things to my teachers, hoping that, and Ryan's smiling when I'm saying this because he's one of our teachers, but hoping that, they would see that and say, oh, wow, that looks cool. I'm going to try that. And then ignore the ones that they didn't care about. But the problem is that most of them thought that I wanted them to do it all. Yeah. And that wasn't my goal. I was just trying to expose them to multiple things.
Yeah. And then the other
hard. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ryan.
I think it is hard when you're receiving, when you haven't built the efficacy. So I think we don't get overwhelmed by teaching strategies because we kind of already have a mental construct to know where and how things fit in, kind of like you said with these tech tools. And that when we first hear tech tools, it feels so massively overwhelming because we don't really have the framework to put the pieces in. And I think this year was really good for developing that framework. So now when we hear something like, I don't know, whatever the next Flipgrid is, we go, oh, that fits in this type of toolbox. And that's this type of tool. But before, we didn't even know what tool did what and how to even use it, I think.
Right. It's almost like a triage mentality, in the hospital. You're looking at what do we need to handle now, right? And before we were in this crazy situation, we weren't so good doing that. We were seeing all the things. And the thing I was thinking about, Eric, when you were mentioning those emails that you were sending out, not only is there that mindset of, oh man, I must need to know all these things, but then even once you know that you actually don't have to know all of those things, you're supposed to pick and choose. The problem is we have that what's called the paradox of choice, which is this fantastic TED Talk by Barry Schwartz is his name. And he talks about how the more choices we have, it's not actually better. We become paralyzed by trying to make the choice. If we have 3 or 4 things to choose from, then we're empowered and we're able to narrow it down to just one. But if we have 15, then we just shut down.
Yeah. Kind of like cognitive load theory. Fran Jost out here talking about cognitive load. And if you got too much going on in the brain, it just shuts down, just keep it focused on the one. So
yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate that advice when it comes to me shooting out strategies. I'm going to send them out in a smaller variety and understand.
Yeah, maybe categorize them. I don't know. That might be a way to do it. Just as a thought, here's what family of tool this fits in or something. Cause then maybe we start to recognize whether or not, like you're saying, it limits the choices, because until we know what it is, then we feel like we have to go learn about it. And then at that point, it's still in the sea of massive choices. Whereas if you say, this is the new PowerPoint, or this is the new Nearpod, or whatever it is, then I think we can go, okay, well, I don't need one like that right now. Or somebody said, yep, that's the tool I need right now.
Right. Or if you feel like you're not getting good formative assessment data, or if you feel like your kids aren't enjoying your review sessions, or if you feel like you're not hearing from all your students, or whatever the symptom is, and that's why, by the way, going to the doctor is easy for us. And that's why it's easy to take advice from the doctor, because we go in and we know what the symptom is and they know what to prescribe to us. So I think, and I did the same thing, Eric, when I was in a tech coaching role and I was sending out those emails, I was prescribing things to people who didn't know they had symptoms or hadn't identified the symptoms or weren't telling me they had symptoms. I wasn't telling them what the potential symptoms were, but at the doctor's office, I go like, hey, doc, my throat hurts. And he says, oh, you could take this. And I'm like, okay, I trust you because you know what the symptom is. I know what the symptom is. And you're telling me this is for that symptom. And I feel like that's kind of what we need in that situation.
Sure.
This is a good segue for the next question, is that what tool has almost moved away from being let's call it a symptom addresser. It's not a treatment anymore. It's actually a necessity. Is there anything that falls into that category that's so necessary that we wouldn't even I don't know. It kind of feels like diet and exercise. You're going to do it all the time, no matter what.
Yeah. I think it's hard for me to narrow it down to one tool, to be honest. I think my biggest thing that I want for my own learners in my own classroom is I want them to be technologically like ambidextrous, right? You think about they could use all of the tools, and I take that back. They shouldn't have to know how to use all of the tools, but they should be able to pivot between tools easily. Like you think about us when we were in school, right? Like when I was a kid, I typed anytime I could type a paper, because we were lucky enough to have a PC in the household. I typed it on WordPerfect. I don't think that's around anymore, right?
That's old school.
Right. When I was in high school, the first tech class I ever took, which was pretty forward thinking at the time, we had a class on HyperStudio, and I made some class projects on HyperStudio, and that still exists, but it's not well known. And my first time browsing the internet, right, was AOL. And yet I do just fine with Google Chrome and Google Slides and Google Docs because I had the time to use those, and I became ambidextrous in my use of them. So I think if our students can do that, then we'll set them up well for their future. I guess maybe the way to do that is to not use the tools in isolation and to use them enough that the kids get comfortable with them, not just use them for one-off things, but make them a part of our classroom, so to speak.
And I'm by no means like a tech expert. I mean, I used to teach a technology class and I was like a building tech support, but I'm pretty good at fidgeting through stuff. And if I click the wrong button, I know how to undo it. So one thing that makes, I guess me kind of ambidextrous is because a lot of these computer programs speak the same language. I mean, right click,
right.
Right click to find it, Control C, Control V, you can kind of work your way through it. So if you've got those general layers of tech skills, then, but speaking of that, I think that's important. We teach the kids those too, because I was in a classroom the other day and we use Microsoft PowerPoint. We're office.com, right? Mm-hmm. This kid was working on his PowerPoint and he couldn't find it, and he's just used to going into PowerPoint and can't find it. So I'm looking and it's called PowerPoint 10, And so I start looking around the other kids and this kid's is called PowerPoint 6. This kid's is called PowerPoint 8. I'm like, my gosh, do you guys name your stuff? Maybe we should start naming our PowerPoints and actually teaching kids how to save them in a location so they know how to find them. So they're not always opening up office.com and just looking for the recent documents.
Yeah. That's all the kids just Google the website they're supposed to go to. Right. And I watch my own kids at home and I go oh, I sent you the link in your email. Because I try to get my own kiddos and used to using technology functionally, and they'll go Google email. Right. There's a button there, right? And so it's these. Yeah, you're right. It's these basic functional skills that we need to build in them.
But back to Ryan's question. So yes, we do want to teach some ambidextrousness, or however you say that word.
Right.
What is your go-to though as a teacher? Back in the day, your go-to was a chalkboard, right? You had to have a chalkboard to teach. Well, we're clearly past that. And I would assume that your go-to is further along than a dry erase board. As an instructor with all this technology, what is it that you can't teach without?
It's an overhead projector and overhead markers and transparency paper. No, there was a year or two of that. And my students could answer this for you. They would tell you Mr. Miller's go-to for sure is Pear Deck. Like it's been huge for me this year. And we're a Pear Deck school where I teach. I also love, through the work that I do and just in the edtech community. I would tell you that Pear Deck and Nearpod and even tools like ClassKick and a couple other ones and ClassFlow all serve the same purpose, which is that I can hear from all of my students. And with eighth graders, especially, that's huge. If I was in a second grade classroom, most of them would just yell out to me and I would hear from them all, right? But for my eighth graders, and that's not entirely true with elementary schoolers, but it's amplified with eighth graders that some of them are not going to speak unless I call on them, and they're not going to feel confident to speak. And this lets me hear from them in a way that not everybody else is seeing their answer. I could showcase it if it's good, and they don't have to feel singled out if it's not good. And especially this year, I'm currently teaching concurrently, which is all kinds of difficult, but it helps me make sure that my kids at home are following along and are understanding too at the same time, because I could see all their answers at once. So Pear Deck or Nearpod or ClassFlow or any tool that gives you that everybody can answer functionality.
And I'm glad you said that, because even though that's not necessarily a significant educational shift, it's certainly a better teaching strategy than asking one or two kids or asking a whole class, do you have any questions? And nobody says anything and you just move on. Using a tool like a Pear Deck where you can hear from everybody at the same time is, I think, invaluable. I think it's
a tech-based total participation technique, which is awesome. It's one more way to do it. And the magic that I think it does seem to have that we don't maybe know how to fully capture yet is you can probably pull some good data from that if you've got the time and the knowledge after the fact.
That's one of the areas where Pear Deck especially is kind of lacking. The data that you could get from it, you'd have to go in there and crunch the numbers yourself. Like it doesn't warehouse it anywhere for you. Nearpod is a little bit better about it, but not great. If you really, the information is there. You've just got to go organize it yourself.
It's not easily sortable.
Right. I think the tools that are great for it, one of my favorites for it is Formative. Formative is a little bit like Pear Deck, a little less of a lesson delivery tool and a little more of a formative assessment tool, obviously. But it can be, your data can be even standards organized, and you could see what standards the kids are doing well at. I do love Pear Deck, but the data piece is something it's lacking in.
But don't let that deter the listeners, because this is your opportunity to get comfortable, because the data is coming. I guarantee it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's
the thing. Go ahead.
That's something that whenever you pick a tech tool, you've got to decide what your priorities are and what your priorities aren't, because you're not going to find a tool that does all of the things for you. And for me as a science teacher, I felt like if I had the live data right then in class and could act on it right then in class, I didn't need a repository of that data. If I ever needed to go back and check on a kid, it's in there. I could dig around and find it. But that was an exception that I made, that I didn't need that. And we do that with all of the tools and things that we use. We make some compromises based on what it is, like, as long as we're getting the things that we set forth to get out of it, which I am getting from it. And that's why it's a great tool for me.
You're back in the classroom this year teaching science, but the past few years, or perhaps more, you were a building tech coach. Now that you've had a taste of kind of leading teachers and seeing that bigger picture, because a lot of times teachers are just kind of in their own bubble and in their own classroom, but you've had a chance to kind of step outside of that bubble and see the bigger picture. What's your biggest takeaway from that experience that changed the way you approach classroom teaching?
I think the thing that I'm better at now in the classroom than I was my first go around. So I was in the classroom for, I think, 12 years and then tech coach for 5 years, now back in the classroom. The thing that I'm better at now is building rapport with my students and a general positivity in my classroom. Like I wasn't always as positive as I try to be now. And I think it's from some lessons that I learned during coaching. And it was a kind of twofold. One was, I tried to, at first, be a tech coach and get teachers' trust by being the guy who knew the technology. And I didn't focus enough on rapport, and I fractured some relationships with the teachers that never trusted me, because of it. I guess I didn't have that rapport with them. But then also with students, with the rapport, there'd be times where I'd be assigned to go teach technology skills to a class, and I would go in there and I'd have a heck of a time. And I would say, gosh, I've been teaching for 14 years and this is the worst class I've ever had in year 14. And it's because I came into that class cold. I didn't have any rapport with them. And I realized how important that rapport building stage was. So I learned it both in the way I interact with the teachers and in the way that then, teaching a class cold feels. And so now I know just how important that is. And now I have a group of students, who have been in my classroom since August. And now I know that they'll do just about anything I ask them to do, because we have trust, we have a relationship, we have rapport. They know I care about them. I know they care about me. And so when I ask them to do something that they maybe don't want to do, they're likely to do it because they trust that I have their best interest in mind. And before, when I was doing that as a tech coach, they didn't know me from the cafeteria worker. They didn't know me from anybody,
That's pretty insightful on the power of relationships, because I know that sometimes when teachers, they sit in the SEL trainings and whatnot, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have time for this because I have so much stuff I need to teach them. But it just gets overlooked that, but are they going to want to learn it if they don't like you?
Right.
So.
Maslow's before Bloom's, right?
Well, you may have even answered my next question with what you just said, but I'm wondering, what is the biggest thing building leaders can do to support innovative teachers? So it could pertain to rapport. I don't know.
Yeah. What
is the biggest thing school districts can do to support innovative leaders to turn those into reality?
Yeah. Well, rapport definitely is huge in both of those areas. And I think oftentimes, I definitely did it as a technology coach. I did not build the rapport. And the ironic thing was I thought I was going to focus on the rapport first when I stepped into that role. And then the things just started coming at me, right? Assignments started coming and new technologies to integrate started coming and initiatives started coming, and I started focusing on them, and I put the rapport on the back burner, and that was a mistake. I think the other thing too is that the leaders can do to support innovative teachers is, and it's something that I didn't realize at the time, is realizing that there's a lot of different things that are effective in the classroom. So encouraging those diverse approaches, like there's a lot of different ways that we could do things that all have merit, that are all good, right? So if I go around telling everybody about project-based learning, for example, which is a phenomenal strategy, and a guy says, well, I have a gamified classroom, right? That's also a phenomenal strategy, right? So that's just, I'm cherry picking an example, but that's both of those approaches are good. And if I celebrate those approaches and I see the value in both of those approaches, then that builds that rapport too. If we could see that different people are able to do different things. I think the other question was about how can the school districts support innovative leaders. So in my position, when I was a tech coach, I was on a teaching contract. I was not an administrator. I was a leader in that I was trying to enact change, but I wasn't technically at an admin level. I felt like the admins that are around me, and this might have just been observed, but I felt like they weren't supported in a way that allowed them to take risks. There was the risks that an administrator deals with and a leader deals with are different from the risks that a teacher deals with. If this lesson goes wrong today for me in class, I could reteach it tomorrow, right? It's going to be okay. But I don't know that the same is true for somebody in a leadership position. And I think you can't be innovative if you can't take risks, and you can't take risks if you're not allowed to fail sometimes. So I think that's probably the thing the leaders need, is that permission to take those risks.
Which maybe is part of the reason why education has such a hard time changing, because, it is kind of that top down, even though that top, and I know I'm in administration, but I know that top, they'll tell the teachers, hey, you got to plan backwards by design. You got to have the end in mind first, and you've got to be all specific. But the way that it comes down sometimes isn't always the way that they're asking us to teach.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so if we're kind of tiptoeing, because it's like you said, if you get in trouble for messing up, then we just got to do exactly what we're supposed to do. And it's hard to kind of get outside the box if you're so worried about getting
called out on the carpet for doing something that wasn't exactly what you were told to do.
Right. How are you going to know if it's going to work unless you're able to try it?
Right. Well, let me ask you this. So you were in PD. It kind of changed the way that you teach. You recognize that you need to build some rapport. Did it change the way that you approach PD as a teacher?
I don't think that experience made the change for me, but I do think over that time I experienced a change in that I realized that there wasn't a one size fits all way to PD, just like our students, right? Some of them learn effectively by direct instruction. Some of them work well in group work. Some of them like to try things out while we go over them. Some of us need to watch us do it first. Some of them, like to work in groups. Some of them like to work independently. I think the same thing's true of PD, right? So some teachers might like kind of a workshop method. Some like, one-on-one support. Some can go watch a video and learn from it. I personally, a lot of my PD comes from listening to podcasts. I have a pretty long commute to work, and I listen to a lot of different education related and education adjacent podcasts. Adjacent meaning that they have an impact and a relation to education, although maybe they're not specifically education related. And so I think finding a way that fits meets your needs and your style, I think is the best way PD can work.
Yeah. Now, do you see that at your school? Is your PD differentiated at your school? Not to get you to talk about your school, but just in general in your experience of PD, because we talked earlier about if we could change something about education, it would be to understand that not all kids learn the same way. They're all different eggs and they all fit differently. Yet professional development is oftentimes delivered the same way that lessons are delivered to students.
Right. I've seen in our district some things where they're one size fits all and other times where there's kind of a pathway with choices to make. And I think automatically having a pathway where you get to make choices and choose what things you want to focus on is more effective, right? We know one of my favorite books is Drive by Dan Pink, and he talks about how one of the motivators is autonomy, right? And so any level of autonomy we're given is going to increase our motivation. I think the best possible situation is the highest possible level of autonomy, which is what do you want to learn? What do you want to get better at? And how can I support you find that content to do it? And that empowers the teacher to take steps. I think there's got to be some stop gates or checkpoints or something in place to identify, to make sure that the task, steps are appropriate and everything. But I think the more choice we can give, the better. And we don't have that situation in our district, but I don't know of any districts that do, not in my experiences. I've led some workshops and things like that where I've given that opportunity, but it's been pretty rare elsewhere that I've seen.
Yeah, it plays out probably a little bit better during in-service than during those daily PD sessions. And, I've been a part of a school where it was differentiated and teachers could sign up. But then, you got your other teachers because, teachers are always, not teachers, but educators, people in general, big lookers for fairness. And if it appears that maybe somebody is not picking enough or whatnot and not being held accountable, then sometimes, it's easier just to go back to the other one than the risk some people having to work harder than others.
Right.
Anyway, so check this out. You got a podcast. You're a teacher. You teach college. You travel and are keynote speakers and work at conferences. You're online. There's a lot of other things in the world. You have a family. You have interests that I'm sure that you do outside of simply family and education. How in the world do you find balance in your life to find time to do everything that gives you passion, yet still remain sane?
I don't know. I don't quite know the answer. This year has been tough. When I was a tech coach, I was able to go home with a different level of energy than I go home from the classroom with. Sometimes I lose that pep in my step after teaching 6 class periods, so it can be tough. But I think the thing that's kept me going as a dad and as a husband and as an instructor in the classroom, and then kind of the stuff I do on the side, is giving myself permission to do what I can and not have to do anything more than that, right? To identify what's important and what's important, and rather than what's necessarily urgent, but do what's important, what's impactful, what meets my goals. And whatever I can't do, I just kind of have to say I can't do it, and I tell people no when I can't, and letting myself feel free in that. And sometimes it's hard, but there's a lot of things I'm just not able to do, or I'm not able to do them as fast as I want to do them, or I'm not able to have the turnaround time I want. And I think I just have to give myself permission to do that. And it's true in my classroom. Sometimes I come back to class the next day after an assessment and say, sorry guys, I haven't finished grading the test yet. I just had to give myself permission that day before to stop grading. Time was up, and I needed to go home and play with the kids or whatever it was. And I think giving that permission to yourself is important.
And you even practiced it with us when you had some family stuff come up.
That's true.
Interview.
Well, you had to go sledding. I mean, who doesn't like to go sledding, right?
Right.
That's true. Yeah, we had gotten a bunch of snow, and I said, guys, we're going sledding. I'm sorry, we got to reschedule.
Rare opportunity.
That's the truth.
Talking about your own PD a little bit again. You did mention Drive by Daniel Pink, which I've had that on my shelf awaiting me to read it. So I'm encouraged to get into it. That's my favorite book that is education related. Really? Okay. I didn't even know it was education related. I knew he had some punchy go get 'em books. So yeah. You can. I wouldn't say he's written it for teachers, but once you're an educator, you can't read that and not feel the education in that book. Like you will feel it. You'll hear that from your lens as an educator for sure. Okay, good to know. What other books or networks in education, other resources, podcasts, et cetera, what do you use to kind of level up your teaching practice, or what would you recommend for teachers that want to do the same? Yeah, so most of my learning comes from social media. I'm a Twitter guy. I've got a list of educators that I follow, and I've kind of whittled it down to there's so many out there. So I have my ones that I focus on. So that's my favorite learning place is Twitter. And if anybody's interested, they could reach out to me on Twitter, and I could point them in the right directions of who to learn from. I also, as I mentioned, learn a lot from podcasts. I think the best place to find podcasts for educators is the Education Podcast Network, which my show is a part of, but it's 25 shows or something like that run the gamut of different aspects on education. So you can go in there and pick out based on what it is you're trying to do in there. In terms of books, I got a couple on my shelf that I'm excited about. The Interactive Class by the Merrills is back here, and the Chromebook Classroom from Holly Clark is there. And then for anybody out there that's interested, this June will be the Educational Duct Tape book from Jake Miller. I heard he's a pretty good guy, and I think his book should be a good one.
Hooray! What is that gonna? So it's called the name of your podcast. So is it just gonna be like a summary of all the different guests that you've had and the tools that you've learned throughout your podcast?
So it's pretty similar to the style of the show. So each chapter has a kind of a fun anecdote and kind of an inspirational. Inspirational seems like an overused term, but a quote and a message maybe to help educators get their mindset right about how to approach technology in their classroom, especially for an educator that's feeling overwhelmed by it. And then each chapter also has some specific tech tools for some specific problems. So one chapter might focus on a good formative assessment tool, and one might focus on good audio tools for hearing students thinking. And then I kind of list out a series of them. So I feel like the second half of the chapter is kind of are like a guidebook that I hope some educators keep on a shelf by their desk. And when they go, I need formative assessment. What does Jake recommend? And they see the 5 things I list in there. But yeah, I'm excited to support educators with it. I really hope that there's some positive effects coming from it.
Excellent. Well, that's the best kind of book, is to get people to keep coming back to it as a resource. So congratulations on
Thank you.
that. And we're looking forward to seeing it out there. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up. We've talked about a lot today. What's the one thing, thinking back to the stuff that we've talked about today, that you want the listener to take away the most from our interview?
I don't know if we talked about it directly, but I think the one thing that I just keep trying to get educators to hear, because I kind of found my zone in supporting educators with educational technology. And the one thing that I keep trying to get them to hear is you don't need to do them all. You don't need to learn them all. You don't even need to be aware of them all. You just have to find the ones that help you with whatever goals you're most focused on. So identify that problem, goal, or need, and then find the tech tools that help support you with it, and narrow it down to one and try it out and see how it goes.
right? Pick one to be an expert on.
Yeah.
Well, how would our listeners get in contact with you? You had mentioned find me through Twitter. Is that one of the best ways? What else?
So I'm on all of the social medias at Jake Miller Tech. Twitter's my favorite, but I'm on the other ones as well, even TikTok.
And then you're saying that you ventured out into the TikTok.
Yeah. It's an interesting place. You go on there and you look at stuff, and you realize all of a sudden it's 20 minutes later, and you're like, "What did I just do? What just happened?" I just watched all these ridiculous videos. There's some good education stuff on there too, though. So at Jake Miller Tech on social media. The podcast is at eduducttape.com, which is DUCTTAPE, and then my website is jakemiller.net.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jake. We know that you are super busy and are honored that you took a few minutes to talk with us tonight on our podcast, and we just appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity, guys. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Ryan.
As always, thank you for checking us out at The Peg Doesn't Fit. We appreciate you listening. You can find us on Twitter at The Peg Doesn't Fit. You can find me at Ryan D. Bartel 1.
And my personal Twitter is at Erich J. Steven. You can also email us at thepegdoesn'tfit@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at anchor.fm/thepegdoesn'tfit.
Drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Tell your educator friends or family, anybody. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week on The Peg Doesn't Fit.
Wow, that is some theme song, isn't it? I did not see that coming when I first fired up my first episode of The Peg Doesn't Fit, but I like it. I like the feel of that theme song, and I definitely liked that conversation with Eric and Ryan, two awesome guys, and I love how open they are about this paradigm shift that they're talking about in education and being open about what's working and what's not working and trying to take steps to make a better system for our students. I also really like the questions they asked, the directions they took the conversation in, and in the show notes, I will include a link to the Peg Doesn't Fit podcast so you can subscribe and listen to more episodes as well as to this specific episode. And again, as a reminder, I'll be back next week with a regular episode featuring a guy with 171,000 YouTube followers and 5 million views, over 5 million views on his collection of edtech videos, and they're phenomenal edtech videos, Sam Carey. So don't miss next week's episode with Sam. And finally, as usual, as a parent, I'm grateful for you, and as a teacher, I'm proud of you. See you next week, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Educational Duct Tape Podcast. Please consider rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app. #EduDuctTape.